Man abandons his sick dog to die on the street, but the next day something unbelievable happens. Have you ever stopped to think about what happens in a dog's heart when he realizes he's been left behind? For us humans, there are always justifications, reasons, excuses that try to alleviate the weight of a decision. But for a dog, none of that exists. He doesn't understand logic. He doesn't make calculations about what's better or worse. He just feels. And when you feel it, you really feel it. Abandonment for a dog is not just a sad event. It is the brutal breaking of a bond that he believed to be eternal. Rocky was always sure that this bond would never be broken. Since he was a puppy, he only knew one world, and that world revolved around Anthony. The owner's scent was the first thing he recognized when he woke up, and the last thing he smelled before going to sleep. Anthony's voice guided her days. His touch was a safe haven. Never for a second did it cross Rocky's mind that one day, Anthony might simply not be there anymore. Anthony, on the other hand, had already lost a lot in his life. He knew well the feeling of seeing something slip through your fingers, of realizing that nothing lasts forever. His look was like someone who had seen everything fall apart more than once, and because of that, he learned to protect himself. He created walls around himself, fortresses that prevented anyone from entering. Anyone except Rocky, because Rocky didn't need to ask permission to be. By Anthony's side, he just was, and that never changed no matter what. When Anthony came home after a hard day, Rocky was there, waiting with his eyes shining with happiness, as if nothing else in the world mattered. When Anthony sank into his own dark thoughts, Rocky lay beside him, demanding nothing, asking no questions, just present. Rocky didn't care if Anthony had failed, if he had made bad decisions, or if the world seemed to be against him. For the dog, Anthony was his only certainty. But then everything started to change. At first it was almost imperceptible, a detail here, another there, nothing that would really raise an alarm. Rocky had always been an active dog, full of energy, one of those who seemed to have an eternal flame inside him. Anthony got used to seeing him running around the house, climbing onto the couch effortlessly, accompanying him on walks as if time had no effect on him. But suddenly, that energy began to waver. Small pauses along the way, a deeper sigh, than normal after a simple game. Anthony didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a bad day, who never wakes up a little more tired? But then came the second day, then the third. Rocky no longer ran to greet him at the door with the same excitement. Her jumps of joy turned into slow, almost careful steps, as if each movement needed to be calculated. His eyes, which had always shone with curiosity and enthusiasm, began to carry a different weight, a silent tiredness, as if something inside him was changing, fading. Still, Rocky was trying. He tried to hide his weakness, tried to maintain his usual routine. If Anthony called him to play, he would get up, even if more slowly. If they went out for a walk, Rocky followed, even though his legs weren't as strong anymore. His loyalty was greater than any pain he might be feeling. But Anthony started to notice. He began to notice how Rocky looked at him in moments when he believed he wasn't being observed. A look that said what words didn't need to say. Anthony wanted to believe it was just age catching up. After all, the years had passed for both of them. Maybe Rocky just needed more rest, a little more care. But a part of him already knew. Something was wrong. Something bigger than just time. The days passed, and what was once just a subtle tiredness turned into something more cruel. First, it was the refusal of food. At first, Anthony thought it was a phase. Maybe Rocky was sick of the same old food. But it wasn't that. The puppy simply began to lose interest. With each missed meal, his body became weaker. Then came the tremors. No warning, no apparent reason. Out of nowhere, Rocky began to shake, as if his own body was failing him. It was a slight tremor at first, almost imperceptible, but it soon intensified. Then came the worst moment. The first time Rocky tried to get up and couldn't. Anthony was in the kitchen when he heard a small sound, a faint scratching on the floor. He turned around in time to see Rocky, trying to steady his paws, but they weren't responding. He tried again, failed. His eyes turned to Anthony, and in that moment, everything inside the man broke. Anthony ran to him, took him in his arms with a care that mixed desperation and fear. I didn't know what to do. Rocky looked at him, as if he was apologizing for not being able to do more, for failing. But Anthony knew it wasn't his fault. The lump in his throat grew, and for the first time in a long time, He felt tears burning his eyes. Since that day, everything got worse. Rocky was no longer able to keep up with Anthony like he used to. Short walks became exhausting. The nights were restless, filled with low moans and heavy breathing. And worst of all, Anthony began to feel Rocky's gaze change. It wasn't just pain, it was a silent surrender, as if somehow Rocky knew he was coming to an end. It was then that the thought began to grow inside Anthony. At first it was just a whisper, something uncomfortable, but distant enough to be ignored. But as the days passed and Rocky got worse, the whisper became a scream. That look, that suffering. Would it be right to allow him to continue like that? Dogs teach us about loyalty in a way no one else can. Rocky came back, even after everything, because for him, love is forever. If you believe that dogs are the most faithful friends there are, comment infinite loyalty. In the comments, leave your like and subscribe for more exciting stories like this. Have you ever felt trapped between guilt and helplessness? Between wanting to save someone you love, but not having the means to do so? Anthony knew that feeling well. He felt her growing inside him like a silent, suffocating shadow. With each tired look from Rocky, with each faltering step, this weight increased, becoming almost unbearable. He spent sleepless nights trying to find a solution, trying to think of something that could reverse what already seemed inevitable. But the truth was harsh. Anthony had no money for treatment, and with each passing day, Rocky suffered more. The decision did not come immediately. At first he fought this thought, refusing to accept it. But then came the moments when Rocky could no longer stand up on his own, the tremors that took him by surprise, the eyes that used to shine and now seemed to carry an invisible weight. Anthony told himself that there was still time, that something could change. But deep down, he knew, and it was this bitter certainty that led him to do something he never imagined he would be capable of. That morning, Anthony woke up earlier than usual. The sun was still stretching over the horizon, and the air carried that biting cold of the early hours of the day. Rocky slept next to the bed, breathing heavily, almost painfully. Anthony stayed there for a while, just watching, trying to commit every detail to memory. The hair wasn't as shiny as before, but it was still the same Rocky, the same puppy who had given him years of unconditional companionship, who never left him alone on bad days, who never demanded anything but love. He ran his hand over the dog's head, feeling the familiar, rough texture. Rocky opened his eyes slowly, drowsily, but when he saw Anthony, he wagged his tail with that little bit of energy he still had. No matter how he felt, Rocky was always happy to see his owner. Always. Anthony tried to swallow the lump forming in his throat. He forced a weak smile, as if everything was fine, but nothing was fine. He got up, took an old blanket and wrapped Rocky in it. The dog did not resist. He blindly trusted his owner. He believed that Anthony knew what he was doing, but if he could talk, maybe he would ask why his eyes were different. Why that grip on his hands when he held him? Why that heavy silence in the air? The path was long. The road was dirt, lined with trees that bent in the wind, casting long shadows across the ground. Anthony drove in silence, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. He avoided looking at Rocky in the back seat, but he felt his presence. He felt the dog's gaze on him, serene, calm. Rocky trusted him, and that made everything even worse. The destination was a remote field, far from the city, far from anywhere anyone could find him. Anthony slowly stopped the car and turned off the engine. He stayed there for a few seconds, looking straight ahead, breathing deeply. He could hear the rustling of trees, the distant sound of birds, the absolute silence of a place where nothing but time existed. He opened the door and went to Rocky. With all the care in the world, he took the dog in his arms and placed him on the dry grass. Rocky didn't protest. He just looked at Anthony with that peaceful expression he always had. He trusted. The wind blew, swaying the leaves around. Anthony bent down, rubbing Rocky's nose one last time. "I'm sorry." The voice came out as a whisper, barely audible. Anthony didn't know whether to say it to Rocky or to himself. The dog just blinked slowly. He didn't understand human words, but he understood gestures. Anthony's scent was still there. His presence was still there. So Rocky didn't worry. But then Anthony stood up and turned his back. He took the first step, then the second. His heart was hammering in his chest, his hands were shaking. He felt like every step was like carrying a rock on his back, as if something inside him was screaming for him to come back. But he didn't come back. Rocky didn't move. He didn't cry. He didn't chase it, just watched. The dog's eyes followed Anthony's every move without understanding. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't make any sound. Just looked. The owner's scent began to disappear, carried away by the wind. His silhouette became smaller, more and more distant. Rocky waited. Maybe Anthony was just going to get something from the car. Maybe he would come back soon. But he didn't come back. And then, for the first time in his life, Rocky felt something he had never felt before. The loneliness. The early morning silence felt different that night. Anthony slept, or at least tried to. His body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't stop. He was rolling around in bed, eyes open in the dark, feeling the weight of the decision he had made. He tried to convince himself that he did the right thing, that there was no other way out. But then, why didn't that feeling of emptiness go away? Why couldn't the image of Rocky's eyes, silent and trusting, leave his head? Ever. Since he returned home, something felt wrong. The house was colder, emptier. It was strange how the silence could be so loud. In recent years, he has become accustomed to hearing Rocky's little presences everywhere. The sound of his paws on the floor, his light breathing in moments of rest, the rustling of his ears when he settled down to sleep. Now, all of that was gone, and Anthony felt his absence as if something inside him had been ripped away, but he needed to move on. It was the best, he told himself. Rocky was suffering, and Anthony only shortened that suffering. I couldn't dwell on that. I needed to accept it. I needed to forget, or at least that's what he thought. Then came the sound, weak, almost imperceptible at first. A scratch on the door. Anthony frowned, still caught between sleep and reality. He thought he imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, a branch dragging against the wood. But then it came again, a little stronger this time. A slow, insistent scratch. He sat up in bed with a start. His heart started to beat faster. The air around him seemed to change, charged with something he couldn't name. His feet touched the cold floor, and he headed for the door, feeling an uneasiness growing inside him. When he turned the handle and opened it, the world stopped. There before him was Rocky, weak, dirty, shaking. But there, Anthony felt his heart skip a beat. It couldn't be. His chest rose and fell in short breaths, as if he had forgotten how air worked. He blinked. Once, twice, but the vision before him didn't disappear. Rocky was there, just as he remembered, but at the same time different. Its body was covered in dust and dry leaves. Its paws had small cuts, as if it had crossed miles of hard ground and sharp rocks. His fur was dirty, matted, and there was an exhausted look in his eyes. But behind the exhaustion, there was something stronger. Determination. Rocky didn't fall. It didn't collapse at its owner's feet. He just stood there, looking at Anthony as if he had never left. As if this was just another normal day. Anthony felt something hot rise up his throat, a lump forming, suffocating. He wanted to speak, wanted to say something, but the words refused to come out. His mind swirled with unanswered questions. How was that possible? How had Rocky found his way back? How was he still alive after everything? The dog didn't seem to care about these issues. He just moved, taking a shaky step forward. His eyes were still fixed on Anthony, and then he did what he always did. He wagged his tail. Slow, faint, but enough to show it was still there, which it always was. It was enough to break any barrier inside Anthony. He fell to his knees in front of the dog, not caring about the cold floor. His arms wrapped around Rocky in a desperate, tight hug, as if trying to assure him that he was real, that he wouldn't disappear again. My God! His voice was shaky, almost inaudible. He buried his face in Rocky's dirty fur, smelling the earth, the road, the superhuman effort that dog had made to get back. And it was at that moment that Anthony realized something he refused to admit from the beginning. Rocky never gave up. Even when Anthony gave up on him, even when he was left alone in the middle of nowhere without strength, without understanding why, he didn't stop. He did not accept his fate. He came back. Rocky's loyalty knew no bounds. As long as his heart beat, he would always find his way back to Anthony. And now, Anthony knew he could never abandon him again. Not everyone knows how to recognize love when it is right in front of their eyes. Some people learn from an early age that affection and affection are fleeting, fragile things, and that sooner or later they end up turning into pain. Anthony was one of those people. He didn't remember exactly when he started building the walls around himself, but by the time he realized it, he was already trapped inside them. Life never gave him many reasons to believe that someone would stay by his side forever. Since he was little, he learned that everything can be taken away without warning. People leave, promises are broken, what seems right today may no longer exist tomorrow. So he decided it wasn't worth getting attached. By clinging on, the loss would hurt more. It was better to stay away. It was better not to need anyone. But Rocky never accepted that idea. Since he was a puppy, he had been there, ignoring any invisible barrier Anthony tried to put up. The dog didn't know the concept of abandonment. He didn't understand why someone would choose to be alone when they could simply love. He didn't need explanations, justifications, promises. He just needed to be close. And for years, that's exactly what he did. Rocky was there when Anthony came home exhausted, when the days seemed too long and the nights unbearable. He was there when Anthony didn't want to talk to anyone, when the world seemed cruel and cold, always lying by his side, always waiting patiently until his owner accepted his presence. But now Anthony had done something he never thought he could do. He had left Rocky behind, and yet the dog came back. The sight of Rocky standing in the doorway, weak, dirty, but with that determined look, made something inside Anthony break. He wanted to hug him. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to tell him that this had all been a terrible mistake, but he couldn't. Instead, he closed the door. It was slow, hesitant, as if his own mind was fighting the decision, but he closed it. On the other side, Rocky stood there. He didn't whine, he didn't scratch the wood. He just lay down and waited. Anthony tried to ignore him. He walked to the kitchen, got a glass of water, and drank it slowly as if he could calm the storm inside him. But the storm continued. Rocky was outside, and Anthony knew. Night fell, and the dog was still there. He had nowhere to go. I didn't want to go anywhere else. His only instinct was to wait. It always was. No matter how long it took, he would always wait for Anthony. Neighbors started to notice. In the morning, when Anthony finally worked up the courage to open the door, Rocky slowly raised his head. His body was weak, exhausted, but he wagged his tail, slowly as if saying, "I knew you would open." Anthony felt time dragging by. Every second of standing there, looking at Rocky, felt longer and heavier than the last. The dog didn't move, just watched him with those serene eyes, without any trace of accusation or resentment, as if it didn't matter what had happened, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The neighbor broke the silence. Her voice carried a tone of curiosity, but also of veiled censorship. She was there every morning, watching life happen from the balcony, always paying attention to what was happening on the street. That day, what caught his attention wasn't a late postman or a child playing on the sidewalk. It was that dog lying at the door, motionless, waiting for someone who might never let him in. Anthony didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. The words caught in his throat, mixed with the guilt he was desperately trying to ignore. He just looked away, as if he could avoid the question, as if he could avoid admitting what he had done. But the street was alive and people were watching. On the other side, a man shook his head with a disapproving expression. It didn't take much to make his opinion clear. "Are you sick or what?" The dog was lying at the door this whole time. This time the words hit differently. They came in like a direct blow, a punch in the gut. Anthony knew no one understood. No one knew what was going on inside him, the confusion, the fear, the past that insisted on holding him back. For the others, everything was simple. A man, a puppy, a door. But for Anthony, it was much more than that. He looked at Rocky again. The dog was still there, the same way. To him, it didn't matter what Anthony was feeling. It didn't matter what happened before. All that mattered was that the owner was there in front of him, and for Rocky, that would always be enough. But what about Anthony? He let out a long sigh, as if he was trying to ease an invisible weight off his shoulders. He passed his hand over his face, trying to dispel the tiredness, trying to organize his own thoughts. He had no answers. I didn't know what to do. And then, without thinking, without planning, he took a step back. Rocky didn't look away. Anthony took another step, and it was as if that small gesture broke some kind of invisible barrier. Rocky raised his head, attentive. He moved his paws slowly, standing up with a little difficulty, but without hesitation. He didn't need permission. He just needed some space to get back to the place that was always his. And without needing a single command, Rocky entered, as if it had never left, as if he knew from the beginning that this was still his home. Not every abandonment happens at once. Sometimes it happens in silence, in small decisions, in avoided glances. The door to Anthony's house was open, but he was still trying to keep Rocky out. The dog didn't understand. For him, his entire life had been simple. Anthony was her world, her home, her reason for being. He didn't know the concept of betrayal or rejection. I only knew love. And love doesn't need logic. It doesn't need justifications. It just exists. And that's why Rocky stayed. In the first few days, he tried to get his owner's attention the way he always did. It approached slowly, swung its tail carefully, looked at Anthony, waiting for an answer. But Anthony didn't look back. Rocky didn't give up. He lay down near the door, watching every movement inside the house, patiently waiting for Anthony to see him again. But the days passed and Anthony kept his distance. It was a rejection that Anthony didn't need to verbalize. It was in the gestures, in the averted glances, in the heavy silence that hung in the air. But if he thought Rocky would give up because of this, he was wrong. Rocky waited. He waited the first night, when he felt the cold of dawn penetrate his tired body, but he still refused to move away. He waited the second night when he realized that Anthony didn't offer him food or a comforting touch. He waited on the third, even when his strength began to waver and his body protested against hunger and fatigue. He stayed, because Rocky never knew how to do anything other than be loyal. But Anthony felt it too. He saw Rocky there, motionless, without understanding why he was being ignored, and that tormented him more than anything. He wondered which was worse, leaving Rocky to die or bringing him back just to treat him like he wasn't there. The dog didn't charge anything. He didn't ask for explanations. He just waited, and Anthony didn't know how to deal with it. People started to notice. The neighbor on the porch, who had already seen Rocky lying on the doorstep the night before, now saw him there all the time. She watched Anthony walk past him without saying a word, without even lowering his gaze. Judgment was in her face. The man across the street noticed it too. "Are you leaving the dog lying there?" he asked one day with a half-disbelieving, half-irritated tone. Anthony didn't respond. He thought ignoring Rocky would make him give up, that at some point the dog would understand and move on. But this idea was absurd. Rocky didn't know the word giving up. Your instinct has always been to stay, to love, to wait, and that's what he did. Even when his body began to weaken, even when his eyes lost some of their shine, even when his paws no longer had the strength they used to, the guilt in Anthony grew like a weight that crushed him, because with each passing day, Rocky became weaker. He could see, I could feel it, but something inside him still held him back, still prevented him from giving in. How long could he keep this wall between the two? How long could Rocky wait? It was supposed to be just another day, another morning where Anthony would open the door, see Rocky there, and pretend he didn't see him. Another day in which he would try to ignore the weight in his chest, telling himself that he was doing the right thing, that he needed to be firm. But that day something was different. The silence felt heavier, as if something had changed in the air. When he opened the door, he expected to see Rocky, as he always did, lying down, waiting, with that look in his eyes that never demanded anything, just remained. But this time, he didn't move. For a second, Anthony froze. The dog was there, the same way, but its body seemed strange, lying in a way that was not normal. His chest rose and fell irregularly. His breathing was too slow. Anthony felt a chill run down his spine. She called to Rocky, waiting for him to lift his head, wag his tail, show any sign that he still had strength. But Rocky didn't react. Anthony's heart skipped a beat. He bent down in a quick movement, his hands shaking as he touched the dog. The fur was hot, hotter than it should be. Weak breathing, a thread of life that seemed about to go out. Anthony felt a wave of panic rise within him. He had seen Rocky slowly wasting away, but until that moment, he had always believed that he would resist, that somehow that stubborn dog would still have the strength to continue. But now, seeing him like this, motionless, vulnerable, something inside him finally gave way. Without thinking twice, he took Rocky into his arms. The puppy was too light. It felt like all the weight from before had disappeared, as if it was slowly emptying. Anthony felt a tightness in his throat, a despair he couldn't name. He entered the house ignoring the fact that until yesterday, he refused to let Rocky walk through that door. Now, all that mattered was saving him. She laid the dog on the living room rug, ran to the kitchen and filled a bowl with water. He hurried back, knelt down beside him, and tried to get him to drink some, but Rocky didn't react. The only thing Anthony managed was a slight movement of his ears, almost nothing that made him realize the gravity of the situation. The dog wouldn't last much longer. The guilt hit hard. He felt like a monster. How were you able to ignore him for so long? How did he manage to close his eyes to something that was in front of him the whole time? Rocky never gave up on him. But he gave up on Rocky, and now it could be too late. But it couldn't be. I wouldn't let it go. With his heart racing, Anthony got up and began to improvise something that could help. He took a blanket and covered Rocky, trying to warm him up. He got some wet food from the kitchen and tried to get him to eat, even if it was a tiny piece. With each failed attempt, panic increased. But then, after a few minutes, Rocky moved his head, opened his eyes, and with great effort, licked Anthony's fingertips. It was a small gesture, but for Anthony it was everything. A spark of hope lit up inside him. Rocky was still there. He still fought. And if he didn't give up, Anthony couldn't give up either. He spent the next few hours taking care of him. He gave him food little by little, trying to make him stronger. He cleaned his fur, removing the accumulated dirt from the days he spent outside. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to just stay there, watching Rocky, without trying to move away, without fighting what he felt. The guilt was still there, heavy and suffocating, but mixed in with it was something new, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Rocky was fighting. After days of not even having the strength to get up, he finally started to react, albeit slowly, even though his body still seemed to weigh tons. Anthony realized this when, for the first time, Rocky lifted his head and tried to move around on his own. It was a small but significant effort. The dog's eyes, even though tired, showed that he was still there, conscious, present. He hadn't given up. But something still wasn't right. Even after eating a little and drinking water, Rocky was still very weak. His breathing was uneven, his body shook at random moments, and Anthony noticed that at times he seemed disoriented, as if he didn't know exactly where he was. Anthony watched all this with a mixture of relief and concern. Yes, Rocky was still alive. But for how long? That uncomfortable feeling was growing inside him, an uneasiness that wouldn't leave him alone. Maybe it was the accumulated tiredness, maybe it was the weight of guilt he still carried, but there was something beyond that, a silent fear, a question he refused to ask out loud. What if Rocky wasn't just sick? This doubt was pounding in Anthony's mind. The more he observed the dog, the more he realized that the symptoms didn't just seem to be a reflection of his age or the time he spent on the street. There was something deeper there, something that went beyond the natural weakness of a weakened body. He could no longer ignore it. That's how, the next morning, Anthony made the decision he should have made from the beginning. He picked up Rocky in his arms as carefully as possible, feeling how he was still too light, too fragile. He left the house without thinking about anything else, just the fact that he needed to find out what was happening. The road to the vet was one of the longest he has ever taken. At every corner, at every red light, Anthony felt his heart tighten a little more. He kept one hand on Rocky, feeling his breathing, making sure he was still there. The dog didn't move much. It just remained lying on the car seat, its eyes half open, watching Anthony with that calm look it always had, as if, even after everything, he still trusted that his owner knew what he was doing. But Anthony didn't know. He had never felt so lost. When they reached the clinic, he rushed in, holding Rocky tightly to his chest. The veterinarian received them with an attentive look, already accustomed to seeing desperate owners arriving at the door with their animals in their arms. Anthony quickly explained the situation, trying not to let his voice shake. He said Rocky was weak, that he refused food for days, that something felt wrong. The vet listened patiently to everything, then picked up Rocky and took him for tests. He asked Anthony to wait at reception. The minutes dragged by. Anthony couldn't sit still. He walked from side to side, his hands clasping his arms, his mind full of thoughts he couldn't control. What if it was something serious? What if there was nothing else to do? He had taken too long to act. What if that delay had cost Rocky his life? Finally, the vet returned. His look was serious, but not in a hurry. He approached Anthony with a cautious air, like someone who chooses his words carefully before speaking. Your dog wasn't just sick. He was poisoned. The phrase took a while to make sense in Anthony's mind. He blinked a few times, trying to absorb those words. What? We found toxic substances in his body, most likely ingested a few days ago, perhaps even longer. That was what caused the extreme weakness, the refusal to eat, the tremors. If he had gone longer without treatment, the veterinarian paused briefly, as if he was considering whether or not he should say that. He wouldn't have survived. The impact of those words was like a punch in the stomach. Anthony felt the floor dissolve beneath his feet, as if there suddenly wasn't enough air in the room. His mind swirled with loose thoughts, memories of the last few days coming back in disorganized flashes. Rocky lying in the doorway, getting weaker and weaker. The moment he fell without the strength to get up, the way he looked at Anthony, not understanding anything. The truth fell on him like an avalanche. If he had left Rocky out there for one more day, a few more hours, he would have died. Not because he was old, not because he was sick, but because someone tried to kill him. Bile rose in Anthony's throat, a mix of anger, fear, and guilt. His chest burned, as if there was something screaming inside him, something he didn't know how to control. "Do you know how this happened?" asked the veterinarian, observing Anthony's reaction. He didn't know, and at the same time, he knew. He remembered the last few weeks, from the streets that Rocky walked alone, after being abandoned, from the neighbors who watched with judgmental eyes, those who disapproved of the dog always being around. And then, a specific memory emerged. That neighbor, who always complained about Rocky's barking, the one who looked at the dog like it was a nuisance. Anthony never paid attention to this before, never thought something like this was possible, but now it all made sense. He felt an anger rise within him, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. How could anyone do this? How could anyone look at a dog like Rocky and want to hurt him? But most of all, the worst question of all, how was he, Anthony, able to leave him to die without even knowing what was happening? He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of guilt crush him. For days he believed he was doing the best he could by walking away. He thought he was sparing Rocky the pain, but in reality, he almost doomed him. He almost lost it. The vet continued talking, explaining the next steps, the care that Rocky would need. But Anthony could barely hear. All he could think about was how he was so blind, how for so long he tried to convince himself that pushing Rocky away was the right thing to do. Now, life was giving him a second chance, and this time he wasn't going to waste it. Anthony's mind could not find rest. Ever since the vet revealed that Rocky had been poisoned, everything inside him had been spinning in a whirlwind of thoughts. The initial shock had already turned into a dangerous mix of anger, guilt, and an uncontrollable need to understand. Who could have done this? Who would have been able to look at a dog like Rocky and wish for something so cruel? Looking at him now, lying on the living room rug, breathing weakly but presently, Anthony felt a crushing weight in his chest. For a long time he avoided getting involved. He avoided creating deep bonds. He avoided caring too much. But now, seeing Rocky there, knowing what he went through and how he fought to get home, Anthony realized he couldn't run anymore. For the first time in a long time, he needed to face things. And that began by discovering who tried to take the life of the only being who never abandoned him. The following days were a test of patience and control. Anthony was never someone who liked confrontation. He always preferred to remain on the sidelines, living his life without major friction. But this time, it was different. With each neighbor he met, with each conversation he overheard, his determination grew. The first clue came almost accidentally. As he walked down the sidewalk, he noticed a group of neighbors talking in low voices. As soon as he got closer, the words stopped. Quick glances were exchanged, and then an older woman, the same one who always watched everything from the balcony, spoke. "Is he better now?" The question was simple, but her gaze carried more than curiosity. Anthony nodded. "Still recovering, but he'll be fine." She sighed, as if she was debating whether or not to say something. Finally, he shook his head. "This neighborhood is no longer the same. There are people here who have no heart." The phrase echoed in Anthony's head as he walked away. He knew there was more behind those words. His instinct told him someone knew what happened. He started to observe more, noting small details, conversations that stopped when he approached, the way some neighbors looked away when they passed your house. There was a name that was repeated, always in whispers, always in sentences cut in half. Cynthia Martin. The man lived a few houses away alone, always with a frown on his face. Anthony never had any direct problems with him, but he also never exchanged more than an apathetic "good morning." However, now as he looked more closely, he began to remember small moments. Martin has complained about Rocky's barking more than once. I have previously spoken openly about how dogs should be kept indoors and away from others. And above all, he never made a point of hiding his contempt for the animals that roamed the neighborhood. That wasn't proof of anything. But Anthony felt he was getting close. Confirmation came in an even more unexpected way. As he was taking out the trash, he heard two children talking. "I saw Mr. Martin throwing that weird powder in his yard again," said one of them. Anthony's blood ran cold. He turned around slowly, trying not to show the tension building inside him. "What powder?" The children looked at each other hesitantly. "I don't know. My father said it's poison for animals. He always says he doesn't like them." That was the last missing piece. Everything fell into place at once, like a punch in the stomach, like a suffocating weight that fell on Anthony's shoulders without mercy. His heart raced, not with fear, but with a fury he barely knew he could feel. His breathing became heavy, every muscle in his body tensed, as if he was about to explode. The anger he had kept bottled up for so long, the silence he had become accustomed to, everything now seemed small in comparison to the devastating truth unfolding before him. How could someone be so cruel? How could anyone look at a puppy like Rocky, who never hurt anyone, who never asked for anything but love, and decide that he didn't deserve to live? Anthony felt his throat tighten as he remembered every moment of the past few days. Rocky, lying on his doorstep, powerless, breathing hard. The way he looked at Anthony, not understanding why he was being ignored, why his owner, the one he loved more than anything, wasn't doing anything to help him. And Anthony, blinded by his own fear, by his own weakness, simply accepted it. He didn't see the signs. He didn't question. He didn't realize that Rocky wasn't just sick, but fighting something much worse. He almost allowed a stranger's cruelty to steal the only good thing he had left in his life. Rocky almost died, and Anthony almost let him die. The weight of this truth was crushing. It hurt more than anything he had ever felt before. For the first time in a long time, he saw his reflection not as an indifferent or lonely man, but as someone who had failed the only creature that had never turned its back on him. But now, not anymore. This time he would do it differently. This time, he would not stand still. For the first time in his life, he wouldn't let fear decide for him. He would protect Rocky. No matter what he had to do, no matter who was behind it, he would find the person responsible, and he wouldn't let it go unpunished. The truth, when it comes out, has a crushing weight. Anthony felt it now, as if something inside him was about to spill over, as if every fiber of his body was pulsing with uncontrollable energy. He always avoided confrontation, always preferred to remain silent, but this time he couldn't ignore it. Not after everything Rocky has been through, not after almost losing him. He could no longer walk around the neighborhood without feeling anger rising within him. Every suspicious look, every silence full of secrets made him realize the obvious. This was not an isolated incident. If someone was able to poison Rocky, they could have done the same to other dogs. How many animals would have suffered in silence with no one to save them? And he knew where to find the answer. Martin's name echoed in his mind. The complaints about the dogs, the looks of contempt, the poison in the yard. Everything pointed to him. Anthony didn't have concrete proof, but he had something even stronger inside him. Certainty. When he arrived at his neighbor's house, he didn't hesitate. He knocked firmly on the door, feeling his own heart hammering in his chest. There was no more room for doubt or fear. Rocky deserved justice, and Anthony wasn't going to leave without answers. Martin opened the door slowly, frowning when he saw him standing there. His gaze carried a mix of surprise and irritation, as if he already knew the reason for that visit. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, impatient. Anthony felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. "I couldn't lose control now. It was you, wasn't it?" His voice was firm, without tremors. "You poisoned my dog," Martin huffed, crossing his arms. "I don't know what you're talking about." But there was something in his gaze, a fleeting flicker of discomfort, a subtle deflection that gave away more than any words. "Don't pretend," Anthony insisted, taking a step forward. "I know what you did, and I know Rocky wasn't the only one." The silence that followed was heavy, dense. Martin pursed his lips, and for an instant, Anthony saw something he hadn't expected. Pride. Not regret, not guilt. Just a man who thought he was right. "Filthy dogs," he said finally, his voice full of contempt. "They make a mess. They bark all the time. They disturb the peace. Someone needed to do something." Anthony felt a lump form in his throat. How could someone say something like that so coldly? How could anyone decide that they had the right to choose who lives and who dies? "You almost killed my dog," he whispered, but his voice carried a menacing weight. "You should be grateful," Martin replied, leaning slightly forward. "I did you a favor. That stray was sick. He was going to die anyway." It was at that moment that Anthony realized there was no redemption there. Martin had no regrets. He saw nothing wrong with what he had done. He felt he had the right to decide the lives of the animals in the neighborhood, and if no one stopped him, he would continue. Anthony took a deep breath, feeling the anger simmering inside him. For years he remained silent in the face of injustice, pretended that he didn't care, that the world was what it was and nothing could change. But not this time. Without saying anything else, he turned and left. But not because he had given up, because this time he knew exactly what he needed to do. When he got home, he picked up the phone with firm hands without hesitation. He called local authorities and reported Martin. He reported everything: the rumors, the suspicions, what Rocky went through, and what he himself heard from the man's mouth. For the first time, Anthony didn't feel afraid to get involved. And when she disconnected the connection, she felt something new grow inside her. For once, he did something right. Time has a strange way of changing things. A few months ago, Anthony was a man who avoided involvement, who preferred silence to confrontation, who believed that some battles simply weren't worth it. But now, as he looked at Rocky lying next to him on the couch, breathing deeply as he slept, he knew that everything had changed. The dog was different, stronger, healthier. The sparkle in his eyes had returned, and so had his energy. He was no longer that fragile dog who fought to survive. But above all, Rocky remained the same in what mattered most: loyal. His gaze always looked for Anthony, as if he wanted to make sure he was still there, that he wasn't going anywhere anymore. And Anthony understood this better than anyone, because he himself had learned never to leave Rocky again. Since the complaint, things in the neighborhood had changed. Martin's case spread among residents like wildfire, sparking reactions that ranged from shock to outrage. Many already suspected, others simply didn't want to believe that someone would be capable of such great cruelty. But the evidence was there. The poison found in the yard, the reports of other owners who lost their dogs without explanation, Martin's own words, full of coldness and indifference. He was still under investigation, but Anthony knew it wouldn't be long before justice was served. But something still bothered Anthony, a persistent feeling that didn't let him relax completely. It was like an instinct, a silent warning that I couldn't ignore, and he wasn't the only one who felt this way. Rocky felt it, too. That night, Anthony was finishing cleaning up the kitchen when he noticed Rocky was restless. The puppy walked from side to side, its ears always pricked, listening for every sound. He growled softly every now and then, and his eyes were fixed on the front door. Anthony frowned. Rocky rarely got like this for no reason. He approached the dog, running his hand over its head in an attempt to calm it. But Rocky remained tense. It was then that Anthony heard it, a noise outside. First faint, almost imperceptible, but then a clearer noise, something moving in the yard. Anthony felt his body go on alert, his senses heightened by fear of what could be. Rocky was already at the door, attentive, as if he was waiting for his owner's command to act. With his heart racing, Anthony grabbed a flashlight and opened the door slowly, trying not to make any noise. Rocky came out first, his steps careful but purposeful. The cub was focused, as if it knew exactly what it was looking for. And then, Anthony saw it. Someone's silhouette near the fence, a bent figure trying to do something on the ground. Anthony's blood ran cold. He shone the flashlight, illuminating the scene, and his stomach dropped as he recognized Martin's face. The man was crouched down, spreading a white powder across the lawn, exactly as the children had said months before. Anger took over Anthony in a second. He couldn't believe what he saw. After everything, after the report, after Rocky almost died, Martin was still doing that. He was still trying to hurt innocent animals. Rocky growled loudly, taking a step forward. Martin turned sharply, his eyes widening for a moment, but soon taking on an expression of pure contempt. "Get out of here," Anthony said, his voice firm but filled with fury. Martin stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, as if he hadn't just been caught in the act. "This is my property," he said, his voice full of arrogance. "I can do whatever I want." Anthony felt his hands shake with anger. "You were going to poison another dog. After everything, do you still think you can do this?" Martin shrugged, as if he saw no problem. "It's not your problem." But it was. It was Anthony's problem. It was Rocky's problem. It was the problem of all owners who lost their dogs without even knowing why. Rocky didn't take his eyes off Martin, his muscles tense, as if he was waiting for the man's slightest wrong move to act. Anthony knew that if he needed to, the dog would move, forward without hesitation. But it wasn't necessary. This time, Anthony already had enough proof. Without looking away from Martin, he took out his cell phone and dialed the number of the authorities. "You're finished," he said, his voice firm. Martin opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of sirens in the distance silenced anything he could say. For the first time, Anthony saw a gleam of terror in her eyes. The man looked around, as if looking for a way out, but this time, there was nowhere to run. The police arrived quickly, and Anthony reported everything. He showed what Martin was spreading around the yard, talked about the previous accusations, about what Rocky went through. Martin tried to argue, tried to say that it was an exaggeration, but no one believed him anymore. This time, justice was served. As they watched the police car leave, Rocky sat next to Anthony, his breathing still slightly quickened, but his gaze calm. He felt it. He knew. The threat was over. Anthony ran, his hand over his head, feeling immense pride rising within him. Rocky had saved his own life when he fought to get home. Now, he had saved the lives of many others, and in the end, he proved that his loyalty could never be underestimated. Some changes happen subtly, almost imperceptibly. Others arrive like a storm, overturning everything that previously seemed solid and unshakable. For Anthony, the change came slowly at first, settling in small moments, in the silences shared, in the looks exchanged with Rocky. But now, looking at the dog beside him, feeling his calm breathing as he slept, he realized that it wasn't just Rocky who had survived all this. Him too. For a long time, Anthony believed he was alone in the world. He got used to the idea that he didn't need anyone, that it was better this way. He created high walls around himself, pushed people away, avoided ties. But Rocky never accepted that distance. Since he was a puppy, the dog has ignored every invisible barrier. Anthony has tried to put up. He didn't care about his owner's silence. He didn't demand words or explanations. It just stayed. And by staying, he did something no one else could. He brought Anthony back into the world. When Anthony left him behind at that camp, he believed he was doing right. He thought he was sparing Rocky from suffering, without realizing that he was actually trying to spare himself the pain of seeing him go. But Rocky came back. He did not accept the fate imposed on him. He fought, survived, found his way back, as if saying it wasn't the end yet. And in doing so, Rocky not only saved his own life, but also Anthony's. The man who had previously avoided involvement now found himself deeply connected to something bigger than himself. The change didn't happen suddenly. It wasn't an instant revelation or an isolated moment of clarity. It was something that grew inside him, slowly, taking space little by little, until it became impossible to ignore. Rocky had taught him that true love doesn't abandon, doesn't give up, doesn't break. He was living proof that loyalty goes beyond words, that the connection between two beings doesn't need explanations to be real. Anthony always believed that it was better to keep his distance, that the world was a cold place and that sooner or later, everything that mattered disappeared. He built this belief over the years, like an invisible armor that protected him from getting hurt. But Rocky ignored these barriers as if they never existed. He never needed invitations, never hesitated to stay. Even when Anthony tried to push him away, even when he was left for dead, Rocky chose to come back. He chose to love, without expecting anything in return. And that lesson weighed on Anthony like a punch in the stomach every time he left the house and saw other dogs roaming the streets. Before, he never paid attention. They were just shadows lost in the city, hungry looks that told him nothing. But now, he saw it. I saw every tail wagging in the hope of affection, every thin, dirty body looking for shelter, every pair of eyes tired but still shining with the same naive faith Rocky had waiting at the door for days. Now, he saw it. And seeing was an impossible weight to carry without doing anything. The decision didn't come as a grand plan. It wasn't a moment of sudden enlightenment. It was an impulse, an instinct, an inevitable necessity. He could no longer close his eyes. I could no longer pretend I didn't see. So he decided to act. In the beginning, it was small. A puppy found on the street, a request for help from a neighbor, a sick animal that needed care. Anthony didn't know much about rescues, he didn't have experience, but he had something stronger than knowledge, the certainty that he needed to do something. He started taking the dogs to the vet, looking for temporary homes, trying to find families for them. With the few resources he had, he did what he could, but he soon realized that that wasn't enough. The world didn't just need Anthony trying to fix what he could with his own hands. I needed more. He needed people who saw what he now saw. I needed voices, action, change. Without realizing it, Anthony started changing his routine. The man who once avoided connections now spent his nights reading about rescuing and recovering abandoned dogs. He learned about trauma, about rehabilitation, about how to help without causing more pain. The man who avoided conversations now involved himself with others who shared the same purpose. He spoke to veterinarians, to animal protectors, to people who dedicated their lives to saving those the world chose to ignore. And with each dog he helped, with each look of silent gratitude he received, he realized he wasn't as alone as he thought. Because at the end of the day, we all need a Rocky to remind us that there is still love in the world, and Anthony was finally ready to give back. How many times have you asked yourself if you really deserved a dog's love? Have you ever looked into his eyes and seen there a devotion so pure that it seemed impossible to reciprocate in the same measure? Anthony asked himself this question every day since Rocky came home. Ever since that dog, who he abandoned without looking back, chose to come back, he chose to forgive. He chose to stay. It was something difficult to accept. How can someone make such a huge mistake, fail so painfully, and still be met with unconditional love? But that was the difference between us and them. Humans are afraid. They hesitate, they hold grudges. Dogs just love it. Rocky never gave up on Anthony, not when he was left behind, not when he spent entire nights waiting at the door, not when cold and hunger tried to take him down. He waited, not because he was naive, but because his heart knew no other option. Because for him, true bonds are not broken, they are not erased, they are not forgotten. And Anthony knew that this loyalty went beyond what any human was capable of offering. People cheat, people lie, people abandon. Not dogs. Dogs stay even when they are hurt, even when they are not understood, even when everything around them tells them they should move on. They choose to stay. But why? What makes a dog continue to love, even after everything? Anthony had already heard stories of dogs who spent years waiting for their owners, who faced storms and hunger to be reunited with those who once welcomed them. Dogs that sat on the side of the road, in the same place where they were left, as if time didn't matter, as if every minute was worth it if there was even a slight chance of being reunited. Rocky was like that. He didn't hesitate to fight his way back home. He didn't hesitate to forgive, even after what Anthony did. His heart held no grudges, only love. And Anthony began to realize how rare this was, not just in puppies, but in life. How many times over the years had he given up on people? How many times have you avoided getting attached for fear of being hurt? How many times have you stopped trying because you believed no one would stay? Dogs never give up on us, even when we give up on them. It was this truth that made Anthony change. He realized that he spent his entire life running away, moving away, protecting himself from something that perhaps didn't even need to be avoided. I believed it was better not to create bonds, because bonds hurt when they break. But Rocky proved that some connections are stronger than time, than pain, than abandonment. And then he asked himself if even a dog can forgive, can start over, can believe in love even after being rejected. Why can't we? How many times do we let fear stop us from trying again? How many opportunities have we missed because we don't believe that something good can still happen? Anthony understood that hiding from the world wasn't protection. It was loneliness. that avoiding love to avoid getting hurt only made him live half-heartedly, and that if a dog like Rocky was able to move on, to get back on his feet, to trust again, so could he. Looking at Rocky, lying peacefully beside him, Anthony realized that this dog had saved him more times than he could count. It saved him from silence, from guilt, from the false belief that no one would stay. And at that moment, he made a decision. If Rocky was capable of loving without hesitation, so would Anthony. Because perhaps the greatest lesson a dog can teach us is that true love doesn't carry hurt, doesn't demand perfection, isn't afraid to start over. And if we learn to love like them, maybe we can be better people. Rocky showed that true love never gives up, and this story proves how much a simple gesture can transform lives. If at any point in this video you connected with this journey, imagined your own dog, or felt the weight of unconditional loyalty, then you already know the impact this can have. Now this message can reach even more people. Leave your Rocky is loyalty in the comments, so this story stays alive. The next video is now on screen and brings further proof that dogs never cease to surprise us. You won't want to miss what comes next.